The funeral program felt heavy in my hands as I sat in the front pew of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, the late morning sunlight casting long shadows through the stained glass windows where my mother had worshipped for 37 years. Margaret Dawson's memorial service was everything she would have wanted: dignified, well-attended, and mercifully brief. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent the last 3 months watching her fade away in that sterile hospital room, only to find myself the center of attention at her final goodbye. She was a pillar of our community, Reverend Williams was saying from the pulpit, his voice carrying that particular cadence reserved for eulogies. A woman who dedicated her life to justice, first as a family court judge, and later as a mentor to countless young attorneys. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I nodded politely, my fingers absently twisting the pearl bracelet she'd given me on my wedding day 15 years ago. Beside me, my 10-year-old daughter Leela sat with her small hand tucked into mine, her dark eyes so much like my mother's, wide with the kind of grief that children carry differently than adults. On my other side, my husband Scott adjusted his tie for the third time, checking his phone discreetly beneath the program. Mom was tough, I had told the Reverend during our planning meeting. She didn't believe in sugarcoating anything, especially not death. Keep it honest. Now, listening to him speak about her legacy as a judge who'd presided over hundreds of custody cases, I wondered what she would make of the mess I'd become in her final weeks. The marketing executive who'd taken an indefinite leave of absence to become a full-time caregiver. The daughter who'd spent 72 days sleeping in hospital chairs and learning to navigate the labyrinth of insurance claims and medical decisions. The service ended with her favorite hymn, "How Great Thou Art," and suddenly everyone was moving, standing, embracing, offering condolences that blurred together in a symphony of "I'm so sorry for your loss" and "She was such a remarkable woman." I found myself nodding and thanking people whose names I should have remembered but couldn't quite grasp. Through the fog of exhaustion, Elena, sweetheart, Mrs. Patterson from Mother's Book Club was saying, grasping my hands with surprising strength for her 82 years. "Your mother was so proud of you. The way you cared for her these past months, she talked about it constantly." "Thank you," I managed, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "She would have done the same for me." Scott appeared at my elbow, his hand warm on my back. "We should head to the cemetery," he said quietly. "The cars are waiting." The graveside service was smaller, more intimate. Just family and close friends gathered around the mahogany casket that had cost more than my first car. I watched them lower my mother into the ground beside my father, who'd been waiting for her for 12 years, and felt something inside me crack open like an egg. "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust," Reverend Williams intoned, and I thought about how Mother had always hated that phrase. "Too morbid," she'd say. "I prefer to think of it as returning to the earth that gave us life." Later, back at the house, my childhood home that I'd been living in for the past 3 months, the rooms filled with the quiet chaos of a post-funeral gathering. The dining room table groaned under casseroles and flower arrangements, and the living room buzzed with the kind of subdued conversation that follows death. I moved through it all like a ghost, accepting hugs and deflecting offers to help clean up. "You should eat something," Scott said, appearing beside me with a plate of food I didn't want. "You've barely touched anything all day." "I'm fine," I lied, accepting the plate because it was easier than arguing. "Just tired." He studied me with those blue eyes that had first attracted me at a law school mixer 16 years ago. "You've been running on empty for months, Elena. Maybe now that," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "maybe now you can take some time to rest, to figure out what comes next." There was something in his tone that made me look at him more carefully. Scott was always composed, always in control. It was what made him such a formidable corporate attorney. But today there was an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite identify. Impatience, maybe? Or was it relief? "What do you mean? What comes next?" I asked. "Just that you've been out of work for 3 months. Leela's been staying with my parents half the time because you've been at the hospital. Maybe it's time to think about getting back to normal." Normal. The word felt absurd. My mother was dead. I'd spent the better part of a year watching her shrink away to nothing, holding her hand through chemo treatments that didn't work and radiation that left her too weak to lift her head. There was nothing normal about any of it. "Scott, she died 4 days ago." I buried her today. Can we maybe table the life planning for a week or two? He had the grace to look embarrassed. You're right, I'm sorry. It's just work has been intense. And with the promotion coming up, I stared at him. Today? You're thinking about your promotion today? That's not what I meant. He glanced around the room, lowering his voice. We'll talk about this later, at home. But we didn't go home. Not right away. After the last guest left and the casseroles were stored in the refrigerator, I found myself alone in Mother's study, surrounded by the organized chaos of a life lived fully. Legal journals stacked on every surface, framed photos of her swearing in ceremony as a judge, the oak desk where she'd spent countless hours writing decisions that would shape families for generations. I was boxing up her personal papers when I found the first of her journals, a leather-bound book tucked beneath a stack of case files. My hands trembled as I opened it to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. Elena, it read in her precise handwriting, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're probably drowning in decisions you never wanted to make. First rule of survival, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Second rule, document everything. Love, Mom. Below that, in fresher ink, was a note dated just 2 weeks ago. I don't trust Scott's motives. Watch him carefully. I stared at the words until they blurred, then carefully closed the journal and slipped it into my purse. Mother had always been intuitive about people. It was what made her such an effective judge. But what had she seen that I'd missed? The answer came 3 hours later, just as Leela and I were finishing a quiet dinner of leftover funeral casserole. The doorbell rang with the sharp insistence of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. I'll get it, Scott said, appearing from the living room, where he'd been on a work call for the past hour. I heard voices at the front door, Scott's measured tones and someone else's clipped, professional responses. When he returned to the kitchen, his face was carefully neutral, but there was something in his posture that set every nerve in my body on high alert. Who was that? I asked. Elena, he said, sitting down across from me. We need to talk. Leela looked up from her green beans, sensing the shift in atmosphere with the radar that children possess. Can I go watch TV? Sure, sweetheart, I said, not taking my eyes off Scott. Turn it up loud. After she disappeared into the living room, Scott reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a thick manila envelope. He placed it on the table between us like a weapon. I didn't want it to happen this way, he said quietly. The timing is awful, and I know you're grieving, but I can't wait any longer. I stared at the envelope, my brain struggling to process what was happening. What is this? Divorce papers. The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually gasped, my hand flying to my chest as if I could somehow catch my breath. What? I filed yesterday. The process server was supposed to come on Friday, but with the funeral you filed yesterday? My voice was barely a whisper. While I was burying my mother? Elena, please listen to me. Our marriage has been over for months. You've been so focused on your mother that you haven't been present for me or for Leela. I need stability. My career needs stability. I opened the envelope with shaking hands, scanning the legal documents that would dissolve 15 years of marriage in the language of whereas and heretofore. The words swam before my eyes, but one phrase stood out with crystalline clarity. Petition for sole custody of minor child. Sole custody? I looked up at him, and for the first time in 15 years, I didn't recognize the man I'd married. You're trying to take Leela? I'm trying to provide her with stability. Elena, look at yourself. You haven't worked in 3 months. You're emotionally fragile. You've been living in your mother's house like some kind of refugee. I was caring for my dying mother, and now she's dead, and you're lost. Leela needs a parent who can function, who can provide for her future. My promotion at Richardson, Wade and Associates comes with a significant salary increase and a clear path to partnership. I can give her the life she deserves. I stared at him across the kitchen table, this man who'd held my hand at my father's funeral, who'd proposed to me in this very room, who'd sworn to love me in sickness and in health. The man who was now calmly explaining why he was destroying our family while our daughter watched cartoons in the next room. When? I asked finally. When what? When did you decide to leave me? When did you stop loving me? He had the decency to look uncomfortable. It wasn't any one moment. It was gradual. The past year, watching you disappear into your mother's illness, I felt like I was married to a ghost. So you decided to ambush me on the day of her funeral. I decided to stop pretending that our marriage was salvageable. I closed the envelope and placed it carefully on the table. Get out, Elena, get out of my mother's house. Now. He stood, adjusting his tie again, a nervous habit I'd found endearing for 15 years and now recognized as the tell of a man who was lying. I'll be staying at the Marriott downtown until I can find an apartment. My attorney will be in touch about custody arrangements. Your attorney? Elena, I'm not the enemy here. I'm trying to do what's best for all of us. After he left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the sound of Leela's cartoons and the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Finally, I pulled out my mother's journal and read her words again. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I thought about Scott's nervous energy all day, his impatience to get back to normal, his sudden concern about stability and his career. I thought about the way he'd been working late more often lately, the way he'd been distracted even before mother's diagnosis. Then I opened the envelope again and read through the divorce papers more carefully. The filing date was clearly marked 3 days ago. But as I looked closer at the paperwork, I noticed something else, a timestamp on one of the supporting documents that made my blood run cold. The initial consultation with his attorney had taken place 6 weeks ago. While I was sleeping in a hospital chair beside my dying mother, Scott had been planning our divorce. I closed the journal and walked to the living room, where Leela was curled up on the couch with her favorite blanket. Sweetheart, I said gently, we need to talk. She looked up at me with those wise, dark eyes. Daddy's not coming home tonight, is he? No, baby, he's not. She nodded solemnly, as if she'd been expecting this. Are you going to be okay, Mommy? I sat down beside her and pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. Yes, sweetheart, we're going to be just fine. As I held my daughter and felt her small body relax against mine, I thought about my mother's second rule: document everything. Tomorrow, I would start fighting back. Tonight, I would grieve not just for my mother, but for the marriage that had died while I wasn't looking. The war was about to begin, and Scott had just made the first and biggest mistake of underestimating his opponent. The law offices of Richardson, Wade and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown Atlanta high-rise, the kind of place where success was measured in billable hours, and corner offices with views of the city skyline. I had been there exactly twice during Scott's 7-year tenure, once for a Christmas party where I'd smiled politely at partners' wives, and once for a charity auction where Scott had bid aggressively on a golf weekend to impress Tom Reynolds, the managing partner who held Scott's career aspirations in his manicured hands. Now, sitting in my rental car across the street at 7:30 in the morning, I watched Scott emerge from his BMW and stride toward the building with the confident gait of a man who believed he was winning. It had been 4 days since he'd blindsided me with divorce papers, 4 days since he'd moved out of our home and into that downtown Marriott, 4 days since my world had shifted from grief to something harder and more focused. My phone buzzed with a text from Veronica Lynn. Meeting at 10. Coffee first? You're going to need it. Veronica had been my study partner at Emory Law School 15 years ago, back when I'd thought I wanted to be an attorney before discovering that marketing suited my temperament better. She'd gone on to specialize in family law while I'd built campaigns for tech startups, but we'd maintained the kind of friendship that could withstand years of Christmas cards and occasional lunch dates. When I'd called her yesterday, voice shaking as I explained Scott's ambush, she'd dropped everything to take my case. On my way, I texted back, then took one last look at the building where my husband was probably already crafting the narrative that would paint me as an unfit mother. An hour later, I sat across from Veronica in her cramped but organized office in Virginia Highland, clutching a coffee that had gone cold while she reviewed Scott's filing. At 41, she still had the sharp-eyed intensity that had made her formidable in law school debates, but her dark hair was now streaked with silver and her face carried the weight of too many custody battles fought on behalf of broken families. He's good, she said finally, setting down the papers. I'll give him that. The language is careful, calculated. He's not calling you crazy outright, but he's building a case for instability. I forced myself to read the sections she'd highlighted. Respondent has been unable to maintain employment due to emotional difficulties, has been residing outside the marital home for extended periods, has demonstrated inability to provide consistent care for the minor child. It's all technically true, I said quietly. I did take leave from work. I was living at Mother's house during her illness. Leela did stay with Scott's parents when I couldn't leave the hospital. But it's truth without context, which makes it a lie. Veronica leaned forward, her voice taking on the edge I remembered from our mock trial competitions. He's taking your devotion to your dying mother and twisting it into abandonment of your family. It's manipulative and it's disgusting, but it's also legally sound. I stared at the papers, feeling the familiar weight of helplessness that had defined the past months. So what do? We fight smart. Scott's made some assumptions about you that are going to cost him. She pulled out a yellow legal pad and clicked her pen. First, tell me about his work situation. You mentioned a promotion? He's been angling for senior partner for 2 years. Tom Reynolds has been dangling it in front of him like a carrot. The firm is very traditional, conservative. They like their attorneys to project stability and family values. Veronica's eyebrows rose. Interesting. So a messy divorce could actually hurt his chances? That's what I thought too. But apparently, he's spinning it as him being the stable parent rescuing his daughter from an unstable situation. She made a note. What about his relationship with Leela? How has that been lately? I thought about the past few months, trying to separate my own hurt from what I'd actually observed. Distant. He's been working late more often, traveling for client meetings. When he is home, he's usually on his phone or his laptop. Leela has been asking for him less and less. Has he ever been inappropriate with her? Harsh discipline? Emotional manipulation? Not that I've seen. He's not abusive, Veronica. He's just absent, self-absorbed. I paused, remembering something. Although, the night he served the papers, after he left, Leela asked me if Daddy was mad at her. She thought the divorce was somehow her fault. Veronica's pen stopped moving. Did you tell her that? Of course not, but she's 10. Not stupid. She can sense when adults are using her as a weapon. Good. That's very good. She made another note. What about finances? How are your assets structured? Joint checking and savings. But most of our investments are in Scott's name because he handles the finances. The house is in both our names. I have some money from Mother's estate, but it's tied up in probate. Employment history? I've been at Meridian Marketing for 8 years. I took unpaid leave when Mother got sick, but my position is being held. Am their senior creative director. I make good money when I'm working. Veronica nodded approvingly. Scott's painting you as unemployable, but that's not true. You took a temporary leave for a family emergency, which any judge would understand. She flipped to a new page. Now, here's what's going to happen. Scott's filed for emergency temporary custody, which means we'll be in front of a judge within 2 weeks. He's claiming you're unfit to care for Leela, so the burden is on us to prove otherwise. How do we do that? We start by showing that you're not the broken woman he's pretending you are. You're going to go back to work, Elena, as soon as possible. You're going to get yourself into grief counseling, which is completely normal and healthy. You're going to document every interaction you have with Leela, every conversation with Scott, every email and text message. I felt something shift inside me, the fog of grief and shock beginning to clear. What else? We're going to dig into Scott's motivations. This timing isn't coincidental. He filed while you were at your most vulnerable, which shows calculation, not concern for Leela's well-being. And if his career is as important to him as you say, then we need to understand exactly what he's protecting. She leaned back in her chair, studying me with the same intensity she'd once directed at opposing counsel. Elena, I need you to understand something. Scott has been planning this for weeks, maybe months. He's had time to prepare, to build his case, to position himself as the victim. We're playing catch up. But we can win? We can win, but not by being nice, not by trying to preserve his reputation or protect his feelings. He chose war when he served you papers at your mother's funeral. So we're going to give him war. That afternoon, I drove to Meridian Marketing's offices in Buckhead for the first time in 3 months. The building looked exactly the same, glass and steel reaching toward the sky. The lobby filled with the kind of modern art that was supposed to inspire creativity but mostly just cost a lot of money. But I felt like a stranger walking through the familiar hallways, nodding at colleagues who offered careful smiles and murmured condolences. Elena, Sarah Chen, my assistant, practically launched herself from her desk when she saw me approaching. I'm so sorry about your mother. How are you holding up? I paused, realizing I didn't have a ready answer. I'm managing. Is David in? David Morrison, the agency's creative director and my boss for the past 5 years, was waiting in his office with the kind of careful expression people wore when they weren't sure if they were supposed to mention the elephant in the room. At 55, he'd built his career on reading people and situations, which made him excellent at managing clients and terrible at hiding his own thoughts. "Elena," he said, standing to embrace me, "I was so sorry to hear about Margaret. She was an incredible woman." "Thank you." I settled into the chair across from his desk, noticing the stack of campaign proposals that had probably been waiting for my approval for weeks. "David, I need to come back to work." He blinked, clearly not expecting this. "Elena, you just buried your mother 5 days ago." "The company policy, I know what the policy says. I also know I've been out for 3 months and you've been covering my accounts. I need to work, David. I need normalcy." He studied my face, and I could see him calculating my value to the agency against the potential complications of a grieving employee having a breakdown in front of clients. "Are you sure you're ready?" "I'm sure I need to be ready." I leaned forward. "Give me the Peterson Industries campaign. I know it's been struggling since I left, and I know what they want." "Elena, the Peterson campaign is worth $2 million. If you're not, I'm not fragile, David. I'm focused." "There's a difference." An hour later, I walked out of the building with a briefcase full of campaign materials and a return date of Monday morning. It felt like the first proactive decision I'd made in months, the first time I'd chosen to move forward instead of simply reacting to circumstances beyond my control. That evening, I found myself back in Mother's study, surrounded by the boxes of her personal papers that I'd been avoiding since the funeral. But tonight, I was looking for something specific. I pulled out her leather journal again and flipped past the first entry to pages I hadn't had the courage to read. "Elena," I found, written in her precise handwriting, dated just 3 weeks before. "She died. I've been watching Scott during these hospital visits, and something isn't right. He's distracted, impatient, checking his phone constantly even when you're crying. He asked me twice about the timing of my treatments, as if my death was an inconvenience to his schedule. A man who truly loves his wife doesn't calculate the impact of her grief on his career. Document everything, sweetheart. Trust your instincts. And remember, in custody battles, the parent who remains calm and rational usually wins. Love, Mom." Below that, in different ink, was another note. "Richardson, Wade and Associates represent several high-profile clients who value family stability in their legal counsel. Scott's promotion depends on maintaining the right image. His divorce strategy is professional, not personal. Use that." I sat back in the leather chair, feeling something cold and sharp settle in my chest. My mother had seen what I'd been too grief-stricken to notice. Scott's ambition had already consumed his love for our family. The divorce wasn't about Leela's well-being or even his unhappiness. It was about his career, his image, his relentless climb toward partnership in a firm that valued appearances over authenticity. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Moore, this is Jennifer Walsh from the family court. You have a hearing scheduled for next Friday at p.m. regarding temporary custody arrangements. Please contact your attorney to confirm." I stared at the message, then at my mother's journal, then at the campaign materials scattered across the desk. Scott had been planning this war for months, positioning himself as the stable parent, while I'd been holding my mother's hand through her final days. He'd counted on my grief to keep me passive, compliant, easy to defeat. He'd made a critical miscalculation. I pulled out my laptop and began typing not campaign copy, but a detailed timeline of the past 6 months. Every late night Scott had worked, every client dinner that had kept him away from home, every time he'd chosen his career over his family, every moment he'd been absent while I'd been present. By the time I finished, it was nearly midnight, and I had 12 pages of documented evidence that Scott Moore was not the devoted father he was pretending to be. But more importantly, I had a strategy. My phone rang, interrupting my work. Veronica's name appeared on the screen. "Sorry to call so late," she said, without preamble, "but I've been doing some research on Richardson, Wade and Associates. Did you know they just landed the Morrison Foundation account?" "No. Why?" "Because the Morrison Foundation is one of the most conservative family values organizations in the Southeast. They donate millions to traditional marriage advocacy. If Scott's firm is representing them, Then his divorce could be more than just a personal embarrassment, it could be a professional liability. I felt a smile tug at the corners of my mouth for the first time in days. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we need to understand exactly what Scott stands to lose if his perfect family image crumbles. And then we need to make sure the right people know just how calculated his timing really was. After she hung up, I returned to my mother's journal and found one final entry, written in a shaky hand that must have been composed during her final days. Sweetheart, I know you think kindness is always the right choice, but some battles require strategy over sympathy. Don't let Scott's ambition destroy what's left of your family. Fight smart, fight clean, but fight to win. Leela deserves a mother who won't surrender. Love always, Mom. I closed the journal and looked around the study, where my mother had spent decades making decisions that would shape families for generations. Tomorrow, I would begin shaping the future of my own family. Scott had chosen the battlefield, but he'd underestimated his opponent. The war was just beginning, and I was no longer grieving. I was planning. The family therapy office smelled like vanilla candles and had the kind of aggressively cheerful decor that was supposed to make children feel safe. Bright purple walls, beanbag chairs scattered around a low table covered with art supplies, and a bookshelf filled with picture books about divorce and big feelings. I sat in the waiting room's uncomfortable chair, watching my 10-year-old daughter fidget with the strap of her backpack while Dr. Angela Becker reviewed the court-ordered evaluation paperwork. Mrs. Moore, Dr. Becker said, emerging from her office with the kind of calm professionalism that made me instantly trust her. I'll be meeting with Leela first, then with you, and later this week with your husband. The court has requested a comprehensive evaluation of the family dynamics to help inform custody decisions. I nodded, trying to project the same composed demeanor I'd been practicing for the past week since returning to work. Leela, you remember what we talked about? Dr. Becker is here to help, and you can tell her anything you want. Leela looked up at me with those serious dark eyes that reminded me so much of my mother. Will you be here when I'm done? I'll be right here in this chair, I promised, squeezing her small hand. Take your time, sweetheart. After they disappeared into the office, I tried to focus on the magazine in my lap, but my mind kept racing through the past week's events. Scott had been true to his word about moving quickly. His attorney had filed motions, requested evaluations, and scheduled hearings with the efficiency of a man who'd been planning this campaign for months. Meanwhile, I'd been playing catch-up, trying to rebuild my professional life while documenting every interaction with my daughter and preparing for a custody battle I still couldn't quite believe was happening. My phone buzzed with a text from Veronica. How's the evaluation going? Remember, this is about Leela's best interests, not proving who's the better parent. Easy for her to say. She wasn't the one whose parenting was being scrutinized by a stranger while her soon-to-be ex-husband sat in his downtown law firm, probably billing hours and planning his next strategic move. 45 minutes later, Leela emerged from Dr. Becker's office looking tired but not distressed. She settled beside me on the waiting room couch while Dr. Becker made notes in her file. How was that, baby? I asked quietly. Okay, Leela said, but she was chewing on her thumbnail, a nervous habit she'd developed over the past few months. She asked me a lot of questions about you and Daddy. What kind of questions? Like where I feel safest and who I talk to when I'm sad and if anyone ever makes me feel scared. She looked up at me with a frown. Mommy, why does everyone keep asking me if I'm scared? I'm not scared of you or Daddy. Before I could answer, Dr. Becker appeared beside us. Leela, would you like to color at the art table while I talk to your mom for a few minutes? After Leela settled herself with a box of crayons and a coloring book, Dr. Becker gestured for me to follow her into the office. The space was warm and inviting, with 2 comfortable chairs facing each other and a desk tucked discreetly in the corner. I noticed she'd placed Leela's artwork, a drawing of our family standing in front of our house, prominently on the side table. How do you think that went? Dr. Becker asked, settling into her chair with Leela's file balanced on her lap. She seemed comfortable with you. Leela's always been good at talking to adults. She is very articulate for her age, very observant. Dr. Becker made a note. I'd like to ask you some questions about your relationship with Leela, and also about the current living situation. For the next hour, I answered questions about everything from Leela's bedtime routine to my plans for returning to full-time work. Dr. Becker was thorough but gentle, and I found myself relaxing slightly as we talked. until she asked a question that made my stomach clench. Leela mentioned that her father has been talking to her about the divorce. Can you tell me about those conversations? What kind of conversations? I asked carefully. She said he's explained that you've been very sad since your mother died, and that he's worried about your ability to take care of her properly. She also mentioned that he's told her not to worry if you seem upset, because he's going to make sure she's safe. I felt my carefully maintained composure crack. He told her I might not be able to take care of her. Those weren't her exact words, but that seems to be the message she received. Dr. Becker leaned forward slightly. Elena, I'm going to be direct with you. Leela is a smart child who's picking up on adult tensions that she shouldn't have to navigate. She's worried about you, but she's also confused about why her father seems to think you're incapable of caring for her. Because he's trying to build a case for sole custody, I said, the words coming out sharper than I'd intended. I'm sorry. I know you're trying to help. It's all right. This is an incredibly stressful situation. Dr. Becker made another note. Can you tell me about Leela's relationship with her father? How has that been lately? I thought about the past few months, trying to be fair despite my growing resentment towards Scott. Distant. He's been working more, traveling for clients. When he is home, he's usually on his phone or laptop. Leela has started coming to me more often when she needs help with homework or wants to talk about her day. Has she expressed any concerns about spending time with him? Not concerns exactly, but I paused, remembering something that had been nagging at me. A few weeks ago, she asked me why Daddy seemed angry all the time. I told her he was stressed about work, but she said it wasn't just work stress. She said he seemed angry at her too. Dr. Becker's pen stopped moving. Did you ask her to elaborate? I tried, but she shut down. You know how kids do when they think they've said something wrong. I do. She glanced at her notes. Elena, I'm going to recommend that we schedule a few more sessions with Leela before I complete my evaluation. I want to make sure I'm getting a complete picture of her emotional state and her relationships with both parents. As we walked back to the waiting room, I noticed that Leela had abandoned her coloring in favor of building something elaborate with the office's collection of wooden blocks. She looked up when she saw us, her face brightening with the kind of smile that could still make my heart skip despite everything else falling apart. Look, Mommy, she said, gesturing to her creation. I built Grandma's house. I knelt beside her, studying the careful arrangement of blocks that did indeed resemble my mother's colonial-style home. It's beautiful, sweetheart. You even got the front porch right. I miss going there, she said quietly. Are we ever going to live there again? The question hit me like a physical blow. Leela had spent countless weekends at my mother's house, helping in the garden and learning to bake cookies in the big kitchen. During Mother's illness, it had become a second home to her, a place of comfort and stability while the adults in her life struggled with medical decisions and insurance forms. I don't know yet, baby. There are some grown-up things I need to figure out first. Is it because Daddy doesn't want us to live there? Dr. Becker was watching this exchange with professional interest, but I could see the wheels turning behind her calm expression. This was exactly the kind of insight she was looking for. How Leela was processing the adult conflicts swirling around her. It's complicated, sweetheart, but whatever happens, you and I will be together, okay? That evening, after Leela was asleep in her room at my mother's house, the place that had become our temporary refuge while Scott lived in his downtown hotel, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and began typing my daily documentation. Veronica had been insistent about this. Every conversation, every interaction, every observation needed to be recorded with dates and times. March 15, 7:30 p.m. Leela asked why she can't talk to Daddy about missing Grandma's house. When I asked what she meant, she said Daddy told her that talking about sad things would make Mommy more upset. She's been keeping her grief about her grandmother to herself to protect me. I stared at the words on the screen, feeling a cold rage settle in my chest. Scott wasn't just trying to win custody, he was manipulating our daughter's emotions, teaching her to hide her feelings and monitor my reactions. He was turning her into a spy in her own family. My phone rang, interrupting my dark thoughts. Scott's name appeared on the screen. Elena, he said without preamble when I answered. I wanted to check on how the evaluation went today. It went fine, I said carefully, knowing that anything I said could be used against me later. Good. I'm sure Dr. Becker will see that Leela needs stability right now. Speaking of which, I think it would be better if you brought her to my hotel for our dinner tomorrow instead of me picking her up. Why? Because that house is depressing, Elena. It's full of reminders of death and sadness. Leela needs to be around positive energy. I gripped the phone tighter, forcing my voice to remain calm. This is her grandmother's house, Scott. It's full of happy memories too, is it? Because from what I can see, you're turning it into some kind of shrine. It's not healthy for either of you. I'm not turning it into anything. I'm dealing with my mother's estate while trying to maintain some stability for our daughter during a divorce I never wanted. Our daughter, he corrected. And maybe that's part of the problem. You're so focused on the past, your mother, your grief, your anger about the divorce that you're not thinking about Leela's future. After he hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen, listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling around me. Upstairs, Leela was sleeping in the room that had been mine as a child, surrounded by the books and toys my mother had saved for her granddaughter's visits. This wasn't a shrine to the dead, it was a bridge between generations, a place where Leela could feel connected to the grandmother who'd loved her so fiercely. I pulled out my mother's journal and flipped to a page I'd been avoiding, one marked with a red tab that suggested urgency. Elena, it read, I've been thinking about what will happen to Leela during this battle Scott is planning. Children often become casualties in custody wars because adults forget that kids see and hear everything. Leela is intuitive, like you were at her age. She knows when adults are being dishonest. Don't underestimate her ability to recognize manipulation, but don't burden her with adult decisions either. Let her truth speak for itself. Below that, in different ink, I've hidden something for you behind the family photo in my bedroom. When you're ready to fight dirty, you'll know what to do with it. I climbed the stairs quietly, careful not to wake Leela, and made my way to my mother's bedroom. The family photo she'd referenced sat on her dresser, a formal portrait taken at Christmas 3 years ago, all of us smiling and properly arranged. In our holiday best. I lifted it carefully and found a small digital recorder taped to the back, along with a note in my mother's handwriting. Scott's phone call from the hospital parking lot, the day I got my terminal diagnosis. He didn't know I was recording from my window. Save this until you need it most. With shaking hands, I pressed play and heard Scott's voice, tinny but clear through the small speaker. Tom, I know the timing isn't ideal, but we need to discuss my partnership timeline. No, I understand the firm's position on family stability, but Elena's situation is actually working in my favor. Well, if she's seen as the unstable one who abandoned her family responsibilities, then the divorce becomes about me protecting my daughter rather than me breaking up a happy home. Exactly. I file while she's distracted with her mother's death, get custody, and by the time the partnership decision is made, I'll be the devoted single father who stepped up when his wife couldn't handle the pressure. I turned off the recorder, my hands trembling with a combination of rage and vindication. My mother had given me exactly what I needed, proof that Scott's custody battle was never about Leela's well-being. It was about his career, his image, his relentless ambition that would sacrifice his own daughter's emotional security for a corner office and a partnership track. But more than that, she'd given me something else, the confirmation that Leela's instincts were right. She'd sensed her father's dishonesty because children always know when adults are lying to them. Dr. Becker would see it too eventually. The question was whether Scott would reveal his true nature before he managed to convince the court that I was unfit to parent my own child. I tucked the recorder into my laptop bag and returned to the kitchen, where I added one final entry to my documentation. March 15, 10:45 p.m., discovered evidence that Scott has been planning this custody strategy since before my mother's death. His motivations are professional, not parental. Leela's emotional well-being is secondary to his career advancement. Tomorrow, I would call Veronica and tell her about the recording. Tomorrow, I would continue building the case that would protect my daughter from becoming a pawn in her father's ambition. Tonight, I would sleep peacefully for the first time since the funeral, knowing that my mother was still fighting beside me, even from beyond the grave. The charity gala for the Morrison Foundation was being held at the Ritz-Carlton downtown, and I watched from my car across the street as Atlanta's legal elite filed through the hotel's gleaming entrance in their evening wear and practiced smiles. I hadn't planned to be here tonight. In fact, I deliberately avoided thinking about the event that Scott had mentioned weeks ago as crucial for his partnership prospects. But Veronica's research had revealed something interesting about Richardson, Wade and Associates' newest client, and sometimes the best intelligence came from observing your opponent in his natural habitat. Through the hotel's floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the ballroom filled with the kind of people who shaped policy and influenced elections from behind mahogany conference tables. Conservative donors who believed in traditional family values, corporate executives who measured success in quarterly reports and stock prices, and attorneys who built their reputations on representing the right kind of clients with the right kind of money. My phone buzzed with a text from Veronica. Package delivered to Tom Reynolds' office this afternoon. Anonymous tip about Scott's timeline. Let's see what happens. The package contained copies of documentation I'd been gathering for the past 2 weeks, phone records showing Scott had contacted his divorce attorney 6 weeks before filing, his hotel receipts from the night he'd moved out that were dated 2 days before he'd told me about the divorce, and most damning, a timeline correlating his legal actions with his partnership review schedule. Everything carefully compiled and presented as an anonymous concern about attorney conduct, sent to the managing partner of Richardson, Wade and Associates. I was about to drive away when I saw Scott emerging from a black sedan at the valet stand, looking polished and confident in his tuxedo. But he wasn't alone. A tall blonde woman in an elegant navy dress took his arm as they walked toward the entrance, and something about their easy familiarity made my stomach clench. I grabbed my phone and took several photos, zooming in enough to capture their faces clearly. The woman was stunning in the way that required significant investment: perfect teeth, designer dress, hair that had been styled to look effortlessly elegant. She was also at least 10 years younger than Scott's 43, with the kind of confidence that came from knowing she was being watched and admired. As they paused at the entrance, Scott leaned down to whisper something in her ear, and she laughed with the kind of intimate delight that spoke of shared secrets. The gesture was casual, comfortable, practiced the body language of a couple who'd been together longer than the 3 weeks since Scott had left our home. I sat in my car for another hour, watching the gala through the windows and taking photographs. Whenever Scott appeared in view, he worked the room with practiced ease, introducing his companion to colleagues and clients, his hand never leaving the small of her back. To anyone watching, they looked like the perfect couple: successful, attractive, stable, everything Scott had accused me of lacking. By the time I drove home to my mother's house, I had 23 photographs and a sixth certainty that Scott's divorce timeline had been driven by more than just career advancement. There had been another woman all along, someone who fit better into his vision of professional success than a grieving wife with complicated emotions and family obligations. The next morning, I sat in Veronica's office, spreading the photographs across her desk like evidence at a crime scene. She studied them with the sharp focus of an attorney who'd seen too many cases of marital betrayal, occasionally making notes on her legal pad. "How long do you think this has been going on?" she asked finally. "I don't know. Months, maybe longer." I pointed to one of the clearer photos. "Look at how comfortable they are together. This isn't a new relationship. Do we know who she is?" I did some research last night. Her name is Christina Valdez. She's a public relations executive who specializes in corporate reputation management. Her firm has done work for several of Richardson, Wade's clients. Veronica's eyebrows rose. "Interesting. So she's not just a girlfriend, she's a professional asset." "Exactly. She makes Scott look good, helps him network, fits perfectly into the firm's image of what a partner's wife should be, except he's still married to you." I leaned back in my chair, feeling the pieces of Scott's strategy finally clicking into place. "He needed the divorce to be my fault, Veronica. If he left me for another woman, especially while I was grieving my mother, he'd look like the villain. But if I was the unstable one who couldn't handle being a wife and mother, then he becomes the hero who stepped up to protect his daughter, and Christina becomes the stable influence who helped him through a difficult time, right? Perfect for his partnership prospects, perfect for his image, perfect for his new life." Veronica gathered the photographs and slipped them into a file. "Elena, this changes everything. We're not just fighting a custody battle anymore, we're exposing a fraud. Scott has been lying to the court about his motivations, lying to his firm about his character, and lying to his daughter about your fitness as a mother. What do we do with this? We use it strategically. The photos alone prove he was in a relationship during the marriage, which supports infidelity claims. But more importantly, they show premeditation. He didn't leave you because you were unfit. He left you because he wanted to be with someone else and needed a way to make it look like your fault." My phone rang, interrupting our planning session. Tom Reynolds' name appeared on the screen. and I felt my pulse quicken. "Mrs. Moore," came the cultured voice of Richardson, Wade's managing partner. "I wonder if you might have time to meet with me this afternoon. There are some matters concerning your husband that I'd like to discuss." 2 hours later, I sat in the opulent conference room of Richardson, Wade and Associates, surrounded by oil paintings of distinguished former partners and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered commanding views of downtown Atlanta. Tom Reynolds was exactly what I'd expected: silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of presence that commanded boardrooms and courtrooms with equal authority. "Mrs. Moore," he began, settling across from me with a thick file that I suspected contained the anonymous package Veronica had sent. "I want to thank you for taking time to meet with me during what I know is a difficult period." "Of course," I replied, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Though I have to admit I'm not sure why you wanted to see me. I've recently become aware of some concerning information regarding the timeline of your husband's divorce filing and his conduct during your mother's illness." He opened the file and withdrew several documents. "I'm hoping you might help me understand the accuracy of these claims." For the next hour, Tom Reynolds walked me through a careful interrogation disguised as concerned inquiry. He asked about Scott's behavior during my mother's illness, the timing of the divorce papers, and my understanding of his motivations for seeking sole custody. I answered honestly but carefully, knowing that every word would be weighed against the firm's reputation and Scott's partnership prospects. "Mrs. Moore," Tom said finally, "I want you to know that Richardson, Wade and Associates takes attorney conduct very seriously. We represent clients who trust us to embody the highest standards of professional and personal integrity." "I understand," I said quietly, "and I've always respected the firm's reputation." "I'm glad to hear that, because I have to tell you, if these allegations about your husband's conduct are accurate, the calculated timing, the manipulation of custody proceedings for career advancement, it would represent exactly the kind of behavior that this firm cannot and will not tolerate." I met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Reynolds, I've never wanted to damage Scott's career. I just want to protect my daughter and maintain my relationship with her, of course. And I want you to know that any decisions this firm makes regarding your husband's employment will be based solely on his professional conduct, not on personal matters between the two of you." As I left the building, I felt a grim satisfaction settling in my chest. Scott had been so focused on positioning himself as the stable, successful father that he'd forgotten his actions had consequences beyond the custody battle. His firm valued reputation above all else, and his calculated manipulation of his family crisis was exactly the kind of scandal that could derail a partnership track. That evening, I found myself back in my mother's study, reading through another section of her journal that I'd been avoiding. This entry was dated just 2 weeks before her death, when the pain medication had made her handwriting shakier but her insights razor sharp. "Elena," it read, "I've been thinking about Scott's visit today and something he said that bothered me. He mentioned twice how important it was for Leela to have stability during this transition, but he never once asked how you were holding up or what support you needed. A man who truly loved his wife would be thinking about her well-being, not positioning himself for custody advantage. He's already emotionally divorced from you, sweetheart. He's just waiting for the legal paperwork to catch up. But here's what he doesn't understand about custody battles. Judges see through calculated performances. They've presided over too many cases where one parent tries to manufacture crises to gain advantage. The parent who remains genuinely focused on the child's emotional needs rather than winning points usually prevails. Scott is playing chess while you're simply trying to protect Leela. That authenticity will serve you well. Also, I've been watching Christina Valdez's social media accounts. Yes, I know about her. Scott isn't as discreet as he thinks. She's been posting photos from events that Scott attended months ago, always carefully cropped to avoid showing her companion but clearly taken at the same venues. The timeline will support your case if you need it. Love, Mom. I closed the journal and pulled out my laptop, navigating to Christina Valdez's Instagram account. My mother had been right. The photos were there, carefully curated glimpses of a sophisticated life that included charity galas, client events, and upscale restaurants. Cross-referenced with Scott's calendar and credit card statements that I still had access to, they painted a clear picture of a relationship that had been developing for months before my mother's death. The next morning brought a call from Veronica, with news that made my coffee taste sweeter. Tom Reynolds just called Scott into a meeting about his partnership status, she said without preamble. My contact at the firm says they're conducting a full review of his conduct during the divorce proceedings. What does that mean for the custody case? It means Scott's credibility is about to take a massive hit. If his own firm questions his integrity, it's going to be hard for him to convince a family court judge that he's the more stable parent. As I hung up the phone, I thought about Scott getting dressed for work this morning, probably confident that his strategy was working perfectly. He had no idea that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling from within, that his own ambition had become the weapon that would ultimately destroy his case. My mother had been right about one thing: authenticity was a powerful force in custody battles. While Scott had been performing stability, I'd been living it. While he'd been calculating advantages, I'd been focused on Leela's actual needs. The war was far from over, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I might actually win. The Fulton County Family Court building stood like a monument to broken dreams, its gray concrete facade matching the overcast sky that had settled over Atlanta for the past 3 days. I sat in Veronica's car in the parking lot, watching lawyers and their clients hurry through the rain toward the entrance, each carrying the weight of fractured families and custody battles that would reshape children's lives forever. Ready for this? Veronica asked, checking her watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. Scott's attorney filed a motion yesterday requesting an emergency review of your fitness evaluation. He's getting desperate. I smoothed my navy blue suit jacket and checked my reflection in the passenger mirror. Professional, composed, the image of a stable mother fighting for her child. Over the past month, I'd perfected this version of myself, learning to channel my rage into quiet determination and my grief into protective resolve. I'm ready, I said, though my hands trembled slightly as I gathered my files. Dr. Becker's report should speak for itself. It does. Leela's sessions were incredibly revealing, and not in the way Scott hoped. Veronica pulled her briefcase from the back seat. Elena, whatever happens in there today, remember that Scott has been planning this for months while you've been playing catch up. But sometimes being authentic trumps being calculating. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh relief, and wooden benches that had witnessed thousands of family dissolutions. Judge Adrienne Keller presided from her elevated bench with the kind of stern competence that suggested she'd seen every manipulation tactic in the book and had little patience for theatrical displays. Scott sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, Marcus Webb, a sharp-faced man in his 50s who specialized in high-conflict custody cases and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. Scott looked polished and confident in his charcoal suit, but I noticed the way his jaw tensed when he saw me enter with Veronica. He'd probably expected me to crumble under the pressure by now, to accept a settlement that gave him what he wanted in exchange for avoiding a public battle. He'd miscalculated, Your Honor. Marcus Webb began after the preliminary motions were settled. My client is seeking emergency temporary custody of his daughter due to serious concerns about the respondent's emotional stability and fitness as a parent. The evidence will show that Mrs. Moore has been unable to maintain employment, has been living in unstable housing arrangements, and has demonstrated concerning behavior during this custody evaluation process. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I felt the familiar cold fury that had been sustaining me through this ordeal. Scott was about to discover that his careful strategy had several fatal flaws. Judge Keller consulted her notes. Mr. Webb, I have Dr. Becker's evaluation report here, and it doesn't seem to support your characterization of Mrs. Moore's fitness. In fact, it raises some interesting questions about your client's conduct. Your Honor, we believe Dr. Becker may have been influenced by Mrs. Moore's manipulation of the evaluation process. We have evidence that she coached her daughter on what to say during therapy sessions. Veronica stood smoothly. Your Honor, we welcome the opportunity to examine this alleged evidence, particularly in light of the discovery materials we'll be presenting today. For the next hour, Marcus Webb attempted to paint me as an unstable mother who'd abandoned her family responsibilities to care for my dying mother, a narrative that sounded increasingly hollow as Judge Keller pressed him for specifics. His evidence consisted mainly of employment records showing my leave of absence and testimony from Scott about my emotional volatility during my mother's illness. Mr. Webb, Judge Keller said finally, caring for a terminally ill parent is not evidence of unfitness. In fact, it suggests exactly the kind of dedication and stability that benefits children. Do you have any evidence of actual neglect or harm to the child? Your Honor, the child has been living in multiple residences. Her mother has been unable to maintain consistent employment. The child has been living primarily in her grandmother's home, which provided stability during a family crisis, Judge Keller corrected. And Mrs. Moore took unpaid leave from a position that was being held for her return. These seem like responsible decisions under difficult circumstances. When Veronica's turn came, she moved with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. She began by entering Dr. Becker's report into evidence, highlighting sections that portrayed me as a devoted mother navigating grief while maintaining my focus on Leela's emotional needs. Your Honor, Veronica said, Dr. Becker's evaluation reveals some disturbing patterns in Mr. Moore's behavior during this custody process. I'd like to call Dr. Becker to testify about her findings. Dr. Angela Becker took the witness stand with the calm authority of someone who'd testified in hundreds of custody cases. She was professional, but clearly sympathetic to children caught in adult conflicts, and her testimony was devastating for Scott's case. Dr. Veronica began, Can you describe Leela Moore's emotional state during your evaluation sessions? Leela is a bright, articulate child who's processing several significant life changes: the loss of her grandmother, her parents' divorce, and the uncertainty about her living situation. What concerned me most was not her grief, which is entirely normal, but her anxiety about expressing her feelings honestly. What do you mean by that? Leela repeatedly mentioned that her father had told her not to upset her mother by talking about said things. She'd been instructed to monitor her mother's emotional state and avoid topics that might cause distress. This kind of emotional caretaking is inappropriate for a 10-year-old and suggests manipulation of the child's natural responses. I watched Scott's face grow pale as Dr. Becker continued her testimony. His attorney was scribbling furious notes, probably trying to find a way to discredit her observations. Did Leela express any preferences about custody arrangements? She consistently expressed a desire to live primarily with her mother while maintaining a relationship with her father. However, she also revealed anxiety about her father's expectations and felt pressure to report on her mother's behavior when she spent time with him. Can you elaborate on that? Leela mentioned that her father asked detailed questions about her mother's activities, mood, and conversations. She felt like she was being asked to spy on her mother, which created significant stress for her. Marcus Webb objected repeatedly during this testimony, but Judge Keller allowed most of it, clearly interested in Dr. Becker's professional assessment. By the time she finished, Scott's narrative of himself as the protective father had been thoroughly dismantled. But Veronica wasn't finished. Her next move was the one we'd been building toward for weeks. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence regarding the timeline of Mr. Moore's divorce filing and his motivations for seeking custody. She began by entering the phone records I'd obtained through discovery, showing that Scott had contacted his divorce attorney 6 weeks before filing while my mother was still alive and receiving treatment. Then came the hotel receipts proving he'd been planning his departure before he'd told me about the divorce. These records show that Mr. Moore began planning this divorce while his wife was caring for her dying mother, Veronica explained. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was calculated to maximize his advantage in custody proceedings. Marcus Webb jumped up. Objection, Your Honor. When my client consulted an attorney is irrelevant to his fitness as a parent. On the contrary, Judge Keller replied, the timing and motivations behind this custody petition are very relevant to my determination of what's in the child's best interests. Continue, Miss Lynn. The next piece of evidence was the one that made Scott visibly flinch: metadata from emails showing he'd been researching custody law and parental fitness evaluations weeks before filing. Veronica had worked with a digital forensics expert to pull deleted files from Scott's work computer, revealing a pattern of premeditation that contradicted his claims of sudden concern about my fitness. Your Honor, this evidence shows that Mr. Moore wasn't reacting to his wife's alleged instability. He was manufacturing a crisis to support a custody strategy he'd already decided upon. But the most damaging revelation came when Veronica presented the email draft that Scott had forgotten to delete from his sent items folder. It was addressed to Marcus Webb and dated 2 days before my mother's funeral. Marcus, it read, I think we should move forward with filing immediately. Elena is completely focused on her mother's situation and won't see this coming. If we can establish temporary custody while she's emotionally compromised, it will be much easier to make the arrangement permanent. The firm's partnership committee. Values, stability, and I need to be seen as the parent who stepped up during the crisis rather than the one who caused it. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Scott's face had gone completely white, and his attorney was frantically shuffling papers as if he could somehow make the evidence disappear. Your Honor, Veronica continued, this email clearly shows that Mr. Moore's custody petition was motivated by career advancement and strategic advantage, not by genuine concerns about his daughter's welfare. He deliberately timed his filing to coincide with his wife's grief to maximize his chances of success. Judge Keller studied the evidence with the kind of cold attention that suggested Scott's strategy was backfiring spectacularly. Mr. Webb, does your client have any explanation for this email? Marcus Webb conferred with Scott in urgent whispers before standing. Your Honor, my client's communication with counsel regarding legal strategy doesn't negate his genuine concerns about Mr. Webb. Judge Keller interrupted. This email suggests your client deliberately chose to file for divorce and seek custody at the moment when his wife was most vulnerable, specifically to gain advantage in these proceedings. That's not legal strategy, that's manipulation of the judicial process. The final blow came when Veronica presented the photographs from the Morrison Foundation Gala, showing Scott with Christina Valdez. Your Honor, these photographs were taken 3 weeks after Mr. Moore filed for divorce, claiming his marriage was irretrievably broken due to his wife's emotional state. However, the metadata and witness statements show that Mr. Moore's relationship with Miss Valdez began months before his wife's mother became ill. I watched Scott sink lower in his chair as the full scope of his deception was laid bare. He'd built his entire case on the premise that I was unfit and unstable, but the evidence showed he'd been planning to leave me long before my mother's illness gave him the perfect cover story. Judge Keller called a brief recess, and I found myself in the hallway with Veronica, both of us trying to process what had just happened in that courtroom. How do you think it went? I asked, though Scott's ashen face had already given me a pretty good indication. I think, Veronica said with a small smile, Scott just learned the difference between being smart and being clever. He was so focused on manipulating the system that he forgot the system is designed to protect children, not ambitious fathers. When we returned to the courtroom, Judge Keller's expression suggested she'd reached some preliminary conclusions about Scott's fitness as a parent. Based on the evidence presented today, she announced, I'm denying the petition for emergency custody modification. Furthermore, I'm ordering a complete review of the custody arrangements with additional psychological evaluation of Mr. Moore's conduct and motivations. Scott's world was crumbling, and the beautiful thing was, he'd built the demolition charges himself. The week following the disastrous discovery hearing had transformed Scott from confident predator to cornered animal, and cornered animals were always the most dangerous. I could see it in the way he'd started showing up unannounced for his scheduled visits with Leela, arriving early as if hoping to catch me in some compromising situation. I could hear it in the tone of his increasingly frequent phone calls to discuss logistics, conversations that felt more like fishing expeditions designed to provoke me into saying something he could use against me later. But the most telling sign of his desperation came on Thursday morning when Veronica called with news that made my coffee turn bitter in my mouth. Scott's attorney has filed a motion to call character witnesses, she said without preamble. They're planning to put people on the stand who will testify about your alleged instability and unfitness as a mother. I set down my mug carefully, my hands steadier than I felt. What kind of people? A former neighbor, your old co-worker Sarah Mitchell from before you went to Meridian, and someone named Dr. Patricia Hendricks who apparently treated you for anxiety 5 years ago. The names hit me like individual slaps. Sarah Mitchell had been jealous of my promotion at our previous company and had made several catty remarks about working mothers when I'd taken maternity leave with Leela. Dr. Hendricks had prescribed mild anxiety medication during a particularly stressful period when Scott had been traveling constantly for work and I'd been managing a difficult client campaign while caring for a teething baby. Neither relationship had ended particularly well, and both women had reasons to harbor resentment. Elena, are you there? I'm here, I managed. When is this happening? Monday. Scott's trying to rehabilitate his image by destroying yours. It's A classic desperation move. But we need to be prepared for some uncomfortable testimony. That afternoon, I found myself back in my mother's study, surrounded by the journals and papers that had become my strategic arsenal over the past months. I pulled out the leather-bound journal and flipped to a section I'd marked weeks ago but hadn't had the courage to read. Elena, my mother had written in her precise handwriting, I've been thinking about the women Scott might try to use against you. If this battle becomes public, Sarah Mitchell has been posting bitter comments about you on social media. I've been monitoring her accounts. Dr. Hendricks violated patient confidentiality when she discussed your case at a medical conference 3 years ago. I have a recording from a colleague who was there. Some people reveal their true character when they think no one is watching. Use this knowledge wisely. Below that, in different ink, was a more recent edition. I've also been researching Scott's character witnesses. Sarah Mitchell was terminated from her last job for falsifying client reports. Dr. Hendricks is currently under investigation by the medical board for inappropriate relationships with patients. Their credibility is more fragile than they realize. I stared at the page, feeling the familiar mixture of grief and gratitude that came whenever I discovered another way my mother was still protecting me from beyond the grave. She'd been preparing for this war even as she was dying, gathering intelligence and building defenses that I was only now beginning to understand. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of March rain that seemed to seep into everything. The courtroom was more crowded than usual. Word had apparently spread through Atlanta's legal community about the Moore custody case, and several attorneys had come to observe what was being described as a textbook example of how not to conduct a custody battle. Scott looked haggard, his usual polish dulled by stress and whatever sleepless nights he'd been enduring. Christina Valdez sat in the gallery behind him, perfectly groomed and supportive, though I noticed she kept checking her phone as if she had somewhere more important to be. Marcus Webb began by calling Sarah Mitchell to the stand. She took the oath with the kind of nervous confidence that suggested she'd been coached extensively on her testimony. At 45, she still carried herself with the brittle efficiency that had made her so unpleasant to work with, her blonde hair perfectly styled and her suit expensive enough to suggest she'd recovered financially since her termination from Morrison and Associates. Miss Mitchell, Webb began, how would you describe your working relationship with Mrs. Moore? Elena was difficult, Sarah said, glancing at me briefly before focusing on the attorney. She was often absent from the office, citing family emergencies or child-related issues. It became clear that her priorities weren't aligned with professional responsibilities. Can you elaborate on these absences? Well, there was the time she left an important client presentation to attend her daughter's school play, and she frequently took calls during meetings that she claimed were from her daughter's school or babysitter. It created an environment where the rest of us had to pick up her slack. I forced myself to remain impassive, though I wanted to stand up and remind everyone that the important client presentation had been scheduled during school hours deliberately by Sarah, who had been angling for my account. The phone calls had been from my mother, who had been experiencing the early symptoms of what would later be diagnosed as cancer. Veronica's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. Miss Mitchell, isn't it true that you were terminated from Morrison and Associates for falsifying client billing records? Sarah's composure cracked slightly. That was a misunderstanding that resulted in criminal charges for fraud, correct? The charges were dropped because you agreed to pay restitution and perform community service, yes? Marcus Webb objected, but Judge Keller allowed the line of questioning to continue. By the time Veronica finished, Sarah's credibility had been thoroughly destroyed, and her testimony about my professional conduct looked like exactly what it was: the vindictive complaints of a disgruntled former colleague with her own ethical problems. Dr. Patricia Hendricks was more challenging. As a licensed psychiatrist, her professional credentials carried weight, and she spoke with the kind of clinical authority that could influence a judge's opinion. She testified about prescribing anxiety medication for me 5 years earlier, describing my condition in terms that made it sound far more serious than it had been. In my professional opinion, she said, Mrs. Moore exhibited signs of significant anxiety disorder and difficulty coping with normal life stressors. The medication was necessary to help her function in her daily responsibilities. Dr. Webb continued, based on your treatment of Mrs. Moore, Do you have concerns about her ability to provide stable care for her daughter during a high-stress situation like a custody battle? I believe anyone with a history of anxiety disorder should be carefully monitored during periods of extreme stress. The pressures of single parenthood could potentially trigger a recurrence of symptoms. The testimony stung because it contained just enough truth to be believable. I had been anxious 5 years ago, overwhelmed by new motherhood and Scott's increasing absence from family life. But Dr. Hendricks was describing a much more severe condition than I'd actually experienced, Veronica's cross-examination revealed. The doctor's own vulnerabilities. Dr. Hendricks, are you currently under investigation by the Georgia Medical Board? The doctor's face flushed. That investigation concerns a completely unrelated matter, related to inappropriate relationships. With patients? I've never had an inappropriate relationship with any patient, but you are under investigation for such conduct? The medical board occasionally receives frivolous complaints, doctor. I'm not asking about the merit of the complaints. I'm asking whether you're currently under investigation. Yes or no? Yes. And isn't it true that you discussed Mrs. Moore's case at a medical conference 3 years ago, despite patient confidentiality requirements? The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Hendricks' face went pale, and Marcus Webb looked like he wanted to object but couldn't find legal grounds. I may have used her case as an example in an educational context, but no identifying information. You used her name, doctor. My colleague has a recording of your presentation. Judge Keller's expression had grown increasingly stern during this exchange. Dr. Hendricks, did you or did you not violate patient confidentiality by discussing Mrs. Moore's case publicly? It was an educational setting. That's not what I asked. Yes, Your Honor. I discussed the case inappropriately. The damage was catastrophic. Not only had Dr. Hendricks' testimony been discredited, but her violation of patient confidentiality had been exposed in open court. Any weight her professional opinion might have carried evaporated in that moment, but Scott's biggest mistake came when Marcus Webb called the final character witness Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an elderly neighbor who had apparently observed my erratic behavior during my mother's illness. Mrs. Hartwell was 83 years old and spoke with the kind of self-righteous certainty that suggested she'd been appointed as the neighborhood's moral arbiter. She testified about seeing me leave the house at odd hours, about loud arguments she'd heard from my mother's home, and about my disheveled appearance during the final weeks of my mother's life. It was clear to me, she said in her quavering voice, that Mrs. Moore was not coping well with her responsibilities. I was very concerned about that poor child. The testimony felt devastating because it painted such an unflattering picture of my lowest moments. But Mrs. Hartwell had made a critical error. She'd claimed to have witnessed events that would have been impossible from her vantage point. Veronica began her cross-examination with deceptive gentleness. Mrs. Hartwell, you testified that you observed Mrs. Moore leaving her mother's house at odd hours. Can you see Mrs. Dawson's driveway from your home? Well, yes, of course. From which room in your house? From my living room window. Veronica pulled out a photograph and aerial view of the neighborhood that I'd had taken weeks earlier. Mrs. Hartwell, this photograph shows that Mrs. Dawson's driveway is completely blocked from your living room window by a large oak tree and your neighbor's garage. How were you able to see Mrs. Moore's comings and goings? Mrs. Hartwell squinted at the photograph, clearly flustered. Well, sometimes I was in my kitchen. Your kitchen window faces the opposite direction, toward the backyard. Were you perhaps observing from your front yard? I may have been working in my garden. At midnight, Mrs. Hartwell? Because you testified that you saw Mrs. Moore leaving at midnight on several occasions. The elderly woman's confusion was painful to watch, but it effectively demolished her testimony. It became clear that she'd been repeating gossip and speculation rather than actual observations, and her testimony crumbled under the gentlest scrutiny. As the day ended, Scott's character assassination attempt had not only failed but had backfired spectacularly. His witnesses had been revealed as unreliable, vindictive, or outright dishonest, while their testimony had highlighted his own desperation and prejudgment. But Veronica wasn't finished. As the court prepared to adjourn, she stood with a request that made Scott visibly flinch. Your Honor, in light of the testimony we've heard today about Mr. Moore's character witnesses, I'd like to submit additional evidence regarding Mr. Moore's own conduct during this custody proceeding. She approached the bench with a file that I recognized it contained the surveillance footage from the hotel where Scott had been staying, showing him bringing Christina Valdez to his room on multiple occasions during hours when he was supposed to be focused on his daughter's well-being. This evidence shows that while Mr. Moore has been claiming that his sole focus is his daughter's stability, he's actually been maintaining a romantic relationship that he's hidden from this court and from his daughter. Judge Keller reviewed the evidence with growing displeasure. Mr. Webb, does your client have an explanation for these images? Marcus Webb conferred urgently with Scott before standing. Your Honor, my client's personal relationships don't impact his fitness as a parent. On the contrary, Judge Keller replied sharply, honesty and transparency are very relevant to parental fitness. Mr. Moore has presented himself as a devoted father whose only concern is his daughter's welfare, while simultaneously maintaining a secret relationship and coaching dishonest witnesses. This pattern of deception is deeply troubling. As we left the courthouse that evening, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and vindication. Scott's desperate attempt to destroy my reputation had revealed his own character more clearly than any evidence I could have presented. His witnesses had been exposed as unreliable or compromised, his motivations had been revealed as self-serving, and his credibility had been shattered. But more than that, I realized that my mother's strategic preparation had been perfect. Every attack Scott had mounted, she had anticipated and prepared defenses for. Even in death, she was still protecting her family, still fighting for justice, still ensuring that truth would prevail over manipulation. The war was almost over, and Scott had just guaranteed his own defeat. The antique brass key felt cold between my fingers as I stood in my mother's bedroom at 3 a.m, unable to sleep after the courtroom devastation I'd witnessed earlier that day. Scott's character witnesses had imploded so spectacularly that even Marcus Webb had looked like he wanted to crawl under the defense table, but something was still nagging at me, a sense that there was one more piece of the puzzle I hadn't found. Yet, my mother had been meticulous in her planning, leaving breadcrumbs throughout her journals that had guided every strategic move I'd made over the past months. But there had been one reference that I'd never been able to decipher, a note written in her shaky, final handwriting that simply said, "When you're ready to end this permanently, look behind the mirror." The full-length mirror in her bedroom had been there for as long as I could remember, an ornate Victorian piece that had belonged to my grandmother. I'd looked behind it dozens of times while cleaning out her effects, but tonight something made me examine it more carefully. The frame was heavier than it should have been, and when I ran my fingers along the back edge, I found a small brass panel that slid away to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside was a manila envelope sealed with red wax, the kind of dramatic touch that was so perfectly my mother. Written across the front, in her careful script, were the words, "For Eleanor Reed when you're ready to win." My hands trembled as I broke the seal and withdrew the contents. There were several documents, but the first was a letter in my mother's handwriting, dated just 2 days before she died. "My dearest Elena," it began, "if you're reading this, then Scott has shown his true nature and you've found the strength to fight back. I'm proud of you, sweetheart, but I'm not surprised. You've always had more steel in your spine than you realized. You just needed circumstances terrible enough to forge it into a weapon. What you're about to read will be difficult, but it will also give you everything you need to protect Leela and end this war permanently. Scott made a critical mistake 15 years ago when he signed your prenuptial agreement. He was so focused on protecting his assets that he never read the clause I insisted your attorney include, the one that voids certain protections if either party engages in conduct that endangers the emotional well-being of any children born to the marriage. I stared at the letter, my heart racing. I barely remembered the prenuptial agreement. It had seemed like a formality at the time, something Scott's firm had insisted upon for all their attorneys. I'd signed it without much thought, trusting that love would make such legal protections unnecessary. The clause is buried in Section 12, subsection 4, and it's written in language that most people would overlook, but it gives you the power to void Scott's claim to marital assets if you can prove he deliberately manipulated custody proceedings for financial gain. Combined with the evidence you've already gathered, this clause will destroy him financially as well as professionally. I fumbled through the other documents in the envelope, finding a copy of the prenuptial agreement with Section 12.4 highlighted in yellow. The language was dense and full of legal jargon, but the meaning was clear. If either party engaged in conduct that deliberately endangered the emotional or psychological well-being of their children for personal gain. They forfeited their claim to shared assets and became liable for all legal costs associated with the divorce. But the most devastating document was the last one, a digital storage drive with a note attached. Elena, I recorded this conversation the day after your father's funeral, when Scott came to discuss our family's future. I never told you about it because I hoped I was wrong about his character. I wasn't. With shaking hands, I carried the drive to my laptop and plugged it in. The recording was 18 minutes long, dated 13 years ago, just weeks after my father had passed away. I pressed play and heard my mother's voice, younger and stronger, greeting Scott with the kind of formal politeness she reserved for people she didn't quite trust. Margaret, came Scott's familiar voice, though there was something in his tone I'd never heard before, a calculated coldness that made my skin crawl. I wanted to thank you again for dinner last night. Elena seemed to be handling everything well. She's stronger than she looks, my mother replied carefully. Grief takes time to process, of course, but I've been thinking about our conversation regarding the trust fund you're establishing for future grandchildren. Elena mentioned you might be considering a substantial amount. I haven't made any final decisions yet. Well, I hope you'll consider the practical implications. Elena and I are planning to start a family soon, and I want to make sure any children we have will be properly provided for. Financial security is crucial for child development. My mother's voice carried a slight edge when she responded. Financial security is important, Scott, but it's not the most important thing for children. With respect, Margaret, that's easy to say when you have money. I've worked hard to build my career, and I intend to provide the best possible life for my future children. That includes protecting their inheritance from potential complications. What kind of complications? There was a pause, and when Scott spoke again, his voice had dropped to a more intimate register, the tone of someone sharing a confidence. Elena's emotional, Margaret. You know that. She makes decisions based on feelings rather than logic. If something happened to me, I'd want to make sure our children's financial future was protected from her tendencies. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother had always been able to read people with surgical precision, and I could practically hear her reassessing every interaction she'd ever had with Scott. I see, she said finally, her voice arctic. And how exactly would you propose to protect your theoretical children from their mother's tendencies? Well, hypothetically, if there were ever custody issues, having financial leverage could be crucial. The parent with the most resources usually prevails in family court. I'm just thinking ahead. Hypothetically, of course. Elena and I are very happy, but a good attorney always considers contingencies. The recording continued for several more minutes, with Scott outlining his theoretical strategies for maintaining control over children he didn't even have yet, using financial resources and legal manipulation to ensure that any future custody dispute would favor him. He spoke about it with the same clinical detachment he might use to discuss a corporate merger, as if he were planning the acquisition of assets rather than the protection of children. When the recording ended, I sat in the darkness of my mother's bedroom, feeling a cold rage settle in my chest that was different from anything I'd experienced during this entire ordeal. This wasn't the desperate manipulation of a man trying to save his career. This was the calculated planning of someone who had been strategizing against his own family from the very beginning. Scott hadn't just filed for divorce while I was grieving. He'd been planning to use our child as a weapon against me since before Leela was even born. I thought about all the times over the years when Scott had made comments about my emotional decision-making or my tendency to overreact. I'd internalized those criticisms, wondering if maybe I was too sensitive, too quick to let feelings override logic. Now I realized he'd been systematically undermining my confidence in my own judgment, creating a foundation for the custody battle he'd always known would come. The next document in the envelope was a copy of financial records that my mother had apparently been tracking for years. Scott's gambling debts from law school that he'd never told me about, credit card accounts opened in my name without my knowledge, and investment losses that had been covered up with money transferred from my personal savings account. But the most damning piece of evidence was a series of text messages between Scott and Christina Valdez, dating back over 2 years. My mother had somehow obtained them through a private investigator, and they painted a picture of a long-term affair that had been carefully hidden while Scott built his case for my unfitness as a mother. The timing needs to be perfect, Scott had written to Christina 8 months ago. Elena's mother is getting sicker, which means Elena will be more distracted and emotional. If I file while she's dealing with grief, she won't be able to mount an effective defense. Christina's response was equally chilling. What about the little girl? Won't this be traumatic for her? Leela will adjust. Kids are resilient, and she'll be better off with stable parenting. Elena's too emotional to raise a child properly anyway. This is what's best for everyone. I printed out every document, every recording transcript, every piece of evidence my mother had gathered over the years. She'd been building a case against Scott since before I'd even realized there was a war being fought, documenting his character and motivations with the thoroughness of a judge who'd spent decades presiding over custody battles. As the sun began to rise outside my mother's bedroom window, I finally understood the full scope of what she'd given me. This wasn't just evidence of Scott's recent manipulation, it was proof of a pattern of calculated deception that stretched back to the beginning of our marriage. He'd married me, not despite my mother's wealth and influence, but because of it. He'd planned to have children not because he wanted a family, but because he wanted leverage, and he'd filed for divorce when he did, not because I was unfit, but because he'd found someone who better suited his image. While my mother's death provided the perfect cover for his betrayal, my phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Veronica's name appeared on the screen. Elena, she said without preamble, I just got a call from Marcus Webb. Scott wants to settle. He's offering joint custody with you as primary parent and no request for alimony. No, I said quietly. Elena, this is a good offer. It gives you almost everything you wanted. No, I repeated, my voice stronger. I'm not settling, Veronica. Not anymore. What's changed? I looked at the documents spread across my mother's bed, evidence of 15 years of manipulation and strategic planning that had culminated in Scott's attempt to steal my daughter while I was burying my mother. I found my mother's final gift, I said, and Scott's about to learn the difference between winning and surviving. After I hung up, I gathered all the evidence into a new file folder and placed it in my briefcase. In a few hours, I would drive to Veronica's office and show her what my mother had uncovered. We would review the prenuptial agreement and prepare motions that would not only secure Leela's custody, but also ensure that Scott faced consequences for his years of deception. But first, I walked to Leela's room and stood in the doorway, watching my daughter sleep peacefully in the same bed where I'd had childhood dreams of my own. She looked so much like my mother in sleep, the same determined set to her jaw, the same strength visible even in repose. Scott had made the mistake of thinking he could manipulate and control both of us. He'd calculated the odds of victory based on his perception of our weaknesses, never realizing that our greatest strength came not from legal strategies or financial resources, but from the unbreakable bond between mothers and daughters that stretched across generations. My mother had spent her final months preparing weapons I was only now learning to wield. But more than that, she'd taught me that sometimes the most devastating victories came not from destruction, but from simply allowing the truth to emerge into the light. Scott wanted a war. What he was about to get was justice delivered with the precision of a judge who'd spent a lifetime protecting families from people exactly like him. The conference room at Richardson, Wade and Associates had always intimidated me. During the few times I'd visited mahogany panels that stretched to the ceiling, oil paintings of distinguished former partners, and windows that offered commanding views of Atlanta's skyline like a statement of the firm's power and permanence. But sitting across from Tom Reynolds and the firm's ethics committee on this gray April morning, I felt none of that old nervousness. Instead, I watched the men in their expensive suits with the calm detachment of someone who held all the cards and was finally ready to play them. Veronica sat beside me, her briefcase containing the documents my mother had left, the recording, the text messages, the financial records that painted a picture of Scott's character that would horrify any law firm concerned with its reputation. Tom Reynolds looked older than he had just weeks ago, the strain of managing the scandal brewing around one of his senior associates evident in the new lines around his eyes. Mrs. Moore, Tom began, his voice carrying the careful formality of a man trying to navigate a minefield. I want to thank you for agreeing to meet with us today. As I mentioned on the phone, the firm has become aware of some concerning allegations regarding your husband's conduct, and we're hoping to understand the full scope of the situation. Of course, I replied, my voice steady. I appreciate your concern for maintaining the firm's integrity during this difficult time. The other committee members, senior partners whose names appeared on letterheads and charity boards throughout Atlanta, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Word had clearly spread through the city's legal community about Scott's imploding custody case, and no one wanted to be associated with an attorney whose manipulations had been exposed in open court. Veronica opened her briefcase and withdrew the first set of documents. Gentlemen, what Mrs. Moore is about to share with you represents a pattern of calculated deception that spans over a decade. This isn't just about a contentious divorce, it's about an attorney who has systematically violated ethical standards while representing this firm. She began with the recording my mother had made 13 years ago, Scott's voice filling the conference room as he outlined his theoretical strategies for using children as weapons in custody battles. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the scratch of Tom Reynolds' pen as he took notes with the grim efficiency of a man documenting a disaster. Jesus Christ, muttered Harold Blackwood, the firm's ethics chair, when the recording ended. Please tell me there's some context that makes this sound less damning than it appears. I'm afraid it gets worse, Veronica said, producing the text messages between Scott and Christina Valdez. She read selected excerpts aloud, each one more devastating than the last. Scott's casual dismissal of Leela's emotional well-being, his calculation of the optimal timing for divorce filing, his confidence that my grief would make me an easy target. Tom Reynolds had gone pale during the reading, his pen motionless as he stared at the transcripts. Mrs. Moore, how long has Mr. Moore been planning this divorce? Based on the evidence we've gathered, at least 2 years, I replied. Possibly longer. The relationship with Miss Valdez appears to have begun shortly after the firm landed the Morrison Foundation account, when Scott realized that his career advancement would be accelerated by having a different kind of wife. A different kind of wife? Veronica handed him Christina's professional biography. Miss Valdez specializes in corporate reputation management. Her client list reads like a directory of Richardson Wade's most important accounts. She's not just Scott's mistress, she's a professional asset who enhances his value to the firm. The committee members exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They were all experienced enough to recognize the implications. Scott hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd been strategically positioning himself for career advancement while using his family tragedy as cover for his betrayal. There's more, I said quietly, producing the financial records my mother had compiled. Scott has been systematically hiding assets and manipulating our joint finances to support his divorce strategy. He opened credit cards in my name without my knowledge, transferred money from my personal accounts to cover his gambling debts, and concealed investment losses that would have impacted the firm's background checks for partnership consideration. Harold Blackwood leaned forward, his expression grim. Mrs. Moore, are you suggesting that Mr. Moore has been defrauding both you and this firm? I'm not suggesting anything, I replied. I'm providing documentation that speaks for itself. The next hour was a methodical dismantling of Scott's carefully constructed image. Veronica presented evidence of his gambling problems, his financial irregularities, and his pattern of using confidential firm resources to research custody law and divorce strategy. Each revelation was more damaging than the last, painting a picture of an attorney who had violated every ethical standard the firm claimed to uphold. But the most devastating evidence came last: a copy of the prenuptial agreement with Section 12.4 highlighted, showing that Scott's manipulations had triggered financial penalties that would leave him virtually destitute. Gentlemen, Veronica explained, this clause voids Mr. Moore's claim to marital assets and makes him liable for all legal costs if he engages in conduct that deliberately endangers his child's emotional well-being for personal gain. Given the evidence of his calculated manipulation of custody proceedings, Mrs. Moore will be seeking full enforcement of these penalties. Tom Reynolds set down his pen and looked directly at me. Mrs. Moore, what outcome are you seeking from this meeting? I had prepared for this question, rehearsing my response until it carried exactly the right balance of reasonableness and steel. Mr. Reynolds, I want 3 things. First, I want the firm to understand that Scott's conduct during this divorce has been calculated and manipulative from the beginning. Second, I want assurance that no firm resources, including letterhead, references, or professional connections, will be used to support his custody case. And third, I want your committee to consider whether an attorney who would deliberately traumatize his own child for career advancement represents the kind of character this firm wants associated with its name. The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, Tom Reynolds spoke. Mrs. Moore, on behalf of Richardson, Wade and Associates, I want to apologize for any way this firm's association may have enabled or encouraged Mr. Moore's conduct. The behavior you've documented is completely contrary to our values and ethical standards. I appreciate that, Mr. Reynolds. I also want you to know that as of this morning, Mr. Moore has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation of these allegations. His partnership consideration has been indefinitely postponed, and depending on the outcome of our review, his employment with this firm may be terminated. I felt a grim satisfaction settle in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. That seems appropriate. Harold Blackwood cleared his throat. Mrs. Moore, the committee will also be filing a complaint with the Georgia State Bar regarding Mr. Moore's conduct. The manipulation of legal proceedings for personal gain is a serious ethical violation that could result in suspension or disbarment. After the meeting ended, Veronica and I walked through downtown Atlanta in companionable silence, both of us processing what had just happened. Scott's world was collapsing with the same systematic precision he'd used to plan my destruction, and the beautiful irony wasn't lost on either of us. How do you feel? Veronica asked as we reached her car. Tired, I admitted, but also vindicated. For months, I've been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if maybe Scott was right about my instability. Now I know that the problem was never my emotional responses, it was his complete lack of them. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Elena, this is Christina Valdez. I need to speak with you urgently. Scott doesn't know I'm reaching out. I showed the message to Veronica, who raised an eyebrow. Interesting. The rats are starting to abandon the sinking ship. We agreed to meet Christina at a coffee shop in Virginia Highland Neutral Territory, where we could assess what she wanted. I arrived first, choosing a corner table where I could observe her entrance. When she walked in 20 minutes later, I was struck by how different she looked from the polished woman I'd seen at the charity gala. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her makeup slightly smudged, and her confident demeanor had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. Elena, she said, sliding into the chair across from me. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know this is awkward. That's one word for it, I replied, studying her face for clues about her motivations. What can I do for you, Christina? I need you to know that I never intended for things to go this far. When Scott and I started seeing each other, he told me you were already separated. He said the marriage had been over for years and that you were just waiting for the right time to file. I kept my expression neutral. And you believed him? I wanted to believe him, she admitted. Scott can be very convincing when he wants something. It wasn't until recently that I started to understand the real timeline. What changed your mind? Christina pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages. These came last night. Scott is unraveling. He's been calling and texting constantly, trying to get me to lie for him, to provide alibis for his whereabouts during key dates. He's becoming desperate and honestly, a little frightening. I read through the messages, each one more frantic than the last. Scott was begging Christina to testify on his behalf, to claim their relationship had begun after our separation, to support his narrative of being the stable parent. His desperation was palpable, and his threats about what would happen if she didn't cooperate suggested a man who'd lost all perspective. Christina, I said carefully, why are you showing me this? Because I have a 10-year-old daughter too, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. And watching Scott manipulate his own child's emotions for his custody case made me realize what kind of man I'd been involved with. No amount of career advancement is worth destroying a child's relationship with her mother. She reached into her purse and withdrew a flash drive. This contains copies of all our communications over the past 2 years, including voice messages where Scott discusses his divorce strategy and his plans for using Leela to hurt you. I thought you should have them. I accepted the drive, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and pity for this woman who'd been as manipulated by Scott as I had, just in different ways. There's something else, Christina continued. Scott has been using firm resources to hire a private investigator to dig up dirt on you and your mother. He's been trying to find anything that would support his claims about your fitness as a parent. The investigator found nothing, but Scott is talking about manufacturing evidence if necessary. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small. Too warm. Manufacturing evidence? Fake photographs, doctored recordings, paid witnesses. He's completely lost perspective, Elena. He's willing to commit felonies to win this custody case. I thought about Leela, asleep in her bed this morning, unaware that her father was planning to destroy her mother through criminal fraud. The image filled me with a cold rage that was becoming familiar, the protective fury of a mother whose child was being used as a weapon. Christina, I said finally, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, but I have to ask, what do you get out of this? Why are you betraying someone you've been involved with for 2 years? She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. Because I realized that if Scott could be this calculating and cruel toward his own wife and daughter, he would eventually turn that same coldness on me and my child. I don't want to be the next woman sitting in a courtroom, fighting for custody against someone who sees children as chess pieces rather than human beings. After she left, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, turning the flash drive over in my hands and thinking about the systematic destruction of Scott's life that was unfolding around me. My mother had been right. Sometimes the most effective revenge was simply allowing someone's true character to emerge into the light where others could see it clearly. Scott had built his entire strategy on the assumption that I was too emotional, too broken by grief, too naive about legal manipulation to fight back effectively. He'd underestimated not just my strength, but my mother's strategic mind and the bonds of loyalty that connected the women in my family across generations. Tomorrow, Veronica would file the additional evidence with the court, including Christina's communications and the information about Scott's plans to manufacture evidence. The custody hearing was still a week away, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Scott Moore had declared war on his own family. What he was about to discover was that some wars aren't meant to be won, they're meant to be survived. And the only survivor in this particular battle was going to be the daughter he'd tried so hard to use as a weapon against her mother. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when I arrived for the final custody hearing, their cameras and microphones creating a gauntlet that I hadn't expected. Word had leaked about Scott's downfall at Richardson, Wade and Associates, and the legal community's fascination with watching a prominent attorney's spectacular self-destruction had drawn media attention that made my stomach clench with anxiety. Mrs. Moore called a reporter from Channel 2 News, thrusting a microphone toward my face. How do you respond to allegations that you orchestrated a campaign to destroy your husband's career? I kept my expression neutral and continued walking toward the courthouse entrance, Veronica's hand steady on my elbow as she guided me through the crowd. We'd discussed this possibility that Scott might try to paint himself as the victim of my manipulation rather than the architect of his own destruction. No comment, Veronica said firmly, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. The fact that reporters were asking about Scott's ruined career rather than my fitness as a mother meant the narrative had shifted completely in our favor. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The gallery was packed with observers, attorneys who'd come to witness the conclusion of what had become a cautionary tale about legal ethics, colleagues from both our professional circles, and what appeared to be several members of the press who'd somehow gained access to the proceedings. Scott sat at the defendant's table with Marcus Webb, but the polished confidence I'd grown accustomed to seeing from both men had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like desperation. Scott's suit was expensive but wrinkled, his usually perfect hair slightly disheveled, and his hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through papers that I suspected contained increasingly desperate legal strategies. Marcus Webb looked like a man who regretted ever taking this case, his briefcase thin and his expression grim. The past week had brought a cascade of revelations that had made defending Scott's fitness as a parent virtually impossible, and I could see in Webb's posture that he was simply trying to minimize the damage to his own reputation. Judge Adrienne Keller entered the courtroom with the bearing of someone who'd presided over thousands of custody cases and had developed a sixth sense for detecting parental manipulation. At 58, she was known for her fairness but also for her intolerance of attorneys who tried to game the system for their clients' advantage. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, settling into her chair with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that would shape children's lives. We're here today for the final custody determination in the matter of Moore v. Moore. Before we proceed, I want to address some recent developments that have come to the court's attention. She opened a thick file that I recognized as containing the evidence Veronica had submitted over the past week, Christina's communications, the recordings my mother had left, and documentation of Scott's increasingly erratic behavior. Mr. Webb, Judge Keller continued, I understand your client has been placed on administrative leave from his law firm pending an ethics investigation. I also understand there are allegations of financial impropriety and potential criminal fraud related to plans to manufacture evidence in these proceedings. Would you care to address these developments? Marcus Webb stood slowly, his usual courtroom confidence nowhere to be found. Your Honor, my client maintains that these allegations are part of a coordinated campaign by his estranged wife to damage his reputation and influence these custody proceedings. I see. Judge Keller's tone was arctic. And does your client have any explanation for the recordings and text messages that document his own words regarding the manipulation of these proceedings? Your Honor, those communications have been taken out of context, Mr. Webb. I've reviewed the full transcripts. In what context would it be appropriate for a parent to describe his child as a weapon to be used against the other parent? The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Scott's face grow pale as his attorney struggled to find an answer that wouldn't make the situation worse. Your Honor, Webb finally said, my client may have used unfortunate language, but his fundamental concern has always been his daughter's well-being. Judge Keller fixed Scott with a stare that could have frozen water. Mr. Moore, would you like to address this court directly? Scott stood on unsteady legs, his usual courtroom presence completely absent. Your Honor, I love my daughter more than anything in this world. Everything I've done has been motivated by my desire to provide her with stability and security. Mr. Moore, I have before me a recording made 13 years ago in which you outlined strategies for using hypothetical children as leverage in custody proceedings. This was recorded years before your daughter was born, which suggests a pattern of calculated planning rather than reactive concern. How do you explain this? Scott's face went white. Your Honor, That was a theoretical discussion about legal strategies. You never intended for your plans to be discovered, Judge Keller interrupted. Mr. Moore, in my 23 years on this bench, I have rarely encountered such a systematic attempt to manipulate the judicial process for personal gain. Your conduct has been a disgrace to your profession and a betrayal of your duties as a parent. She turned to the court reporter. Let the record reflect that this court finds Mr. Moore's testimony and his documented conduct to be fundamentally at odds with the best interests of the minor child. The next hour was a methodical presentation of evidence that left no doubt about the court's eventual ruling. Veronica presented Dr. Becker's updated evaluation, which included Leela's statements about feeling pressured to spy on me and her anxiety about her father's expectations. The psychological damage of Scott's manipulation was laid bare in clinical detail that made several observers in the gallery visibly uncomfortable. Christina Valdez's evidence was particularly devastating. The text messages and voice recordings showed Scott's complete disregard for Leela's emotional well-being, his willingness to traumatize his own daughter to achieve his goals, and his increasing desperation as his strategy began to fail. But the most powerful moment came when Judge Keller called for Leela's voice to be heard. Rather than forcing my 10-year-old daughter to testify in open court, she reviewed the recorded sessions Leela had done with Dr. Becker, playing selected excerpts that revealed a child's clear understanding of her father's dishonesty. I love my daddy, came Leela's voice through the courtroom speakers, but he makes me feel scared sometimes. He asks me questions about mommy that feel like tattling, and when I don't want to answer, he gets this look on his face that makes me think I did something wrong. The innocence in her voice contrasted sharply with the sophisticated manipulation she was describing, and I could see several people in the gallery wiping their eyes. Judge Keller's expression had grown increasingly stern as she listened to my daughter navigate adult deceptions that no child should have to understand. When the evidence presentation concluded, Judge Keller called a brief recess. I found myself in the hallway with Veronica, both of us trying to process the systematic destruction of Scott's case that we'd just witnessed. How do you think she'll rule? I asked, though the answer seemed obvious. I think, Veronica said with a small smile, Scott is about to learn that there are consequences for treating your family like a business acquisition. When court reconvened, Judge Keller's demeanor had the gravity of someone about to deliver a verdict that would reshape lives forever. In the matter of Moore, she began, This court has carefully considered all evidence regarding the best interests of the minor child, Leila Moore. After thorough review of the testimony, psychological evaluations, and documented evidence of parental conduct, I am prepared to render my decision. The courtroom fell silent except for the soft clicking of the court reporter's machine and the barely audible sound of Scott's labored breathing. I hereby award sole physical and legal custody of Leila Moore to her mother, Eleanor Moore, effective immediately. The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Several reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks while Scott slumped in his chair as if he'd been physically struck. Furthermore, Judge Keller continued, this court finds that Mr. Scott Moore's conduct during these proceedings has been so fundamentally contrary to his daughter's best interests that supervised visitation is the only arrangement consistent with the child's safety and emotional well-being. Marcus Webb half rose from his chair. Your Honor, surely supervised visitation is excessive, Mr. Webb. Your client has demonstrated a willingness to manipulate, deceive, and emotionally abuse his own child for personal gain. He has shown complete disregard for her psychological well-being and has repeatedly prioritized his career advancement over her emotional safety. Supervised visitation will continue until such time as Mr. Moore can demonstrate genuine rehabilitation and a commitment to his daughter's well-being over his own interests. But Judge Keller wasn't finished. This court is also referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential criminal charges related to conspiracy to manufacture evidence and fraud. Mr. Moore's conduct has not only damaged his family but has undermined the integrity of these proceedings. Scott finally found his voice, standing on shaking legs. Your Honor, please. I can't lose my daughter. She's everything to me. Judge Keller's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. Mr. Moore, if your daughter was truly everything to you, you would never have used her as a weapon against her mother. You would never have manipulated her emotions for your own advantage. You would never have planned to destroy her family while she was grieving her grandmother. She gathered her papers and stood. This court is adjourned. As the judge left the bench, the courtroom erupted in a cacophony of voices, reporters asking questions, observers discussing the verdict, and the sounds of Scott's complete breakdown as the reality of his losses hit him fully. He'd lost custody of Leila. He'd lost his career. He was facing potential criminal charges. And most devastatingly, he'd lost any claim to being the victim in this situation. I felt Veronica's hand squeeze my shoulder as we gathered our papers. Elena, you did it. You protected Leila and you exposed Scott for exactly what he is. But my attention was focused on Scott, who was now sobbing openly at the defendant's table while his attorney tried unsuccessfully to comfort him. For a moment, I felt something that might have been pity, this broken man who'd orchestrated his own destruction through his relentless ambition and manipulation. Then I thought about Leila, waiting at home with my mother's friend who'd been babysitting during the hearing. I thought about the stable, loving life I could now provide for her without the constant threat of Scott's manipulation and legal warfare. As we left the courthouse, pushing through the crowd of reporters who shouted questions about Scott's downfall and my plans for the future, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. The war was over. We had won. And most importantly, Leila was safe. Outside on the courthouse steps, a reporter managed to get close enough to ask, Mrs. Moore, how does it feel to have destroyed your husband's life? I stopped and looked directly into the camera, thinking about my mother's journals and her lessons about justice versus revenge. I didn't destroy Scott's life, I said quietly. I simply allowed the truth about his character to emerge. The destruction was entirely his own creation. As we walked away from the courthouse, Veronica asked, what's next for you and Leila? I thought about my mother's house, about the job waiting for me at Meridian Marketing, about the future that was now mine to shape without the shadow of Scott's manipulation hanging over us. Now, I said, we rebuild, we heal, and we move forward. The custody battle was over, but the real victory was just beginning. 6 months later, I sat in the auditorium of Leila's school, watching my daughter perform in the spring talent show with a confidence and joy that had taken weeks to rebuild. After the custody battle, she stood center stage in her grandmother's pearl earrings, the ones my mother had worn to her own judicial swearing-in ceremony 40 years ago, singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow with a clear, strong voice that filled the room with hope. The irony of the song choice wasn't lost on me. We had indeed found ourselves somewhere over the rainbow, in a place where storms were distant memories and the future stretched ahead bright with possibility. Leela's voice soared on the high notes, and I felt tears slip down my cheeks, not tears of grief this time, but of profound gratitude for the second chance we'd been given to build a life free from manipulation and fear. "She's beautiful," whispered Sarah Chen, my assistant from Meridian Marketing, who'd become a close friend during the months when I'd needed allies more than colleagues. "She looks so much like you did at that age, but I saw my mother in Leela's poise, in the way she commanded the stage with quiet authority, in the strength that seemed to emanate from her small frame. The 3 generations of women in our family had each faced their own battles, and we'd emerged stronger for having fought them together, even when one of us was no longer physically present." After the performance, Leela bounded down from the stage and into my arms, her face flushed with excitement and pride. "Did you hear how I hit that high note, Mommy? Mrs. Patterson said it was perfect." "It was absolutely perfect, sweetheart," I said, holding her close and breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Grandma would have been so proud." "I know," Leela said with the matter-of-fact certainty that had always characterized her relationship with my mother. I could feel her watching. Later that evening, after we'd celebrated with ice cream and phone calls to relatives who'd watched the performance via video link, I tucked Leela into bed in what had officially become her permanent bedroom in my mother's house. The custody arrangement had been finalized 3 months ago, with Scott's supervised visitation reduced to 2 hours every other Saturday at a court-appointed facility after he'd missed 4 consecutive scheduled visits. "Mommy," Leela said as I smoothed her blanket, "do you think Daddy will ever get better?" The question caught me off guard, as Leela's insights often did. We'd been working with a family therapist to help her process the divorce and her father's manipulative behavior, but she still occasionally asked questions that reminded me how perceptive children could be about adult complexities. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said honestly. "I hope he will, for his own sake. But what I do know is that you and I are going to be just fine, no matter what choices Daddy makes." "Good," she said, snuggling deeper into her pillow. "Because I like our life now. It feels peaceful." Peaceful. The word perfectly captured what I'd been struggling to articulate about our new existence. Gone was the constant undercurrent of tension that had characterized our marriage, the feeling of walking on eggshells around Scott's moods and expectations. Gone was the anxiety about whether my parenting decisions would be scrutinized and criticized. Gone was the exhausting effort of maintaining a relationship with someone who saw our family as a series of strategic advantages rather than people worthy of love. After Leela fell asleep, I made my way to my mother's study, which had become my own workspace as I'd slowly but deliberately reclaimed every aspect of my life. The room still smelled faintly of her perfume, and her law books remained on the shelves alongside my marketing journals and campaign portfolios. It felt like a bridge between past and present, between the woman who'd taught me about justice and the woman I was becoming as I applied those lessons to rebuilding my life. Veronica arrived at 8 o'clock with a bottle of wine and the satisfied expression of an attorney who'd just closed a case that would be discussed in law schools for years to come. Over the past months, she'd become more than my legal counsel. She'd become the kind of friend who showed up with wine when you needed to process major life transitions. "How's our girl doing?" she asked, settling into the leather chair that had once been my mother's favorite spot for reading case files. "Thriving," I said, pouring us each a glass of the Pinot Grigio she'd brought. "Her confidence is completely restored, her grades are excellent, and she's making new friends at school. Dr. Martinez says her anxiety levels are back to normal for a child her age. And how are you doing?" "Really?" I considered the question as I settled into my own chair, thinking about the woman I'd been 6 months ago compared to who I was today. "I'm different," I said finally, "stronger, but also more aware of what I'm capable of when someone threatens my family. Good, different, or concerning different. Good, different, I think. I used to worry that I was too emotional, too reactive. Scott spent years convincing me that my instincts weren't trustworthy, that my feelings made me weak. Now I understand that my emotions weren't the problem, his complete lack of them was." Veronica nodded approvingly. "And professionally, how's the transition back to full-time work going?" "Better than expected." David gave me the Morrison Industries account, ironically, the same foundation that Scott's firm lost when the scandal broke. It's satisfying to be building campaigns for organizations that actually value family stability rather than just using it as a marketing tool. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the dramatic transformation that had occurred since that awful day when Scott had served me with divorce papers. The legal battle was over, but the emotional healing was an ongoing process that required patience and forgiveness, not for Scott, but for myself, for the years I'd spent doubting my own perceptions and accepting treatment that I would never tolerate today. "Have you heard anything about Scott lately?" Veronica asked carefully. "Some," I admitted. "Christina Valdez called last week. Apparently, he's been living in a studio apartment downtown, working as a contract attorney for personal injury firms. The state bar suspended his license for 2 years, and Richardson Wade fired him the day after the custody hearing. And the criminal charges? The DA decided not to prosecute the evidence manufacturing conspiracy, but Scott pled guilty to financial fraud charges related to the credit cards he opened in my name. He got probation and has to pay restitution." Veronica shook her head. "He destroyed his entire life for a custody battle he never had a chance of winning once the truth came out. I think," I said slowly, "that Scott's problem was never about winning or losing. It was about control. He couldn't accept that there were consequences for his actions, that other people, especially women, weren't just supporting characters in his success story." Well, he certainly learned about consequences. I thought about that assessment as we finished our wine and Veronica prepared to leave. Scott had indeed learned about consequences, but I wasn't sure he'd learned anything meaningful about character or empathy. The last time Leela had seen him during supervised visitation, she'd come home confused by his self-pity and his continued insistence that everyone else was to blame for his situation. "The strangest thing," I told Veronica as she gathered her purse, "is that I don't hate him anymore. I pity him, but I don't hate him. That's probably healthy, maybe. Or maybe I'm just too happy with our new life to waste energy on anger." After she left, I climbed the stairs to check on Leela one more time, finding her sleeping peacefully with one arm wrapped around the teddy bear my mother had given her for her 5th birthday. The sight filled me with the same profound gratitude I'd felt during her performance earlier, gratitude for safety, for stability, for the freedom to make decisions based on love rather than legal strategy. I made my way to my own bedroom, stopping at my mother's vanity, where I'd placed her final journal, the one I'd been writing in since the custody battle ended. Tonight's entry was brief but significant. "Leela performed beautifully tonight. She's healing, growing, becoming the confident young woman that mother always knew she could be. I've been thinking about the lessons this experience has taught us both, that truth has power, that families protect each other across generations, and that sometimes the greatest victory is simply the freedom to live without fear. I understand now why mother prepared so carefully for this battle. She knew that some people see kindness as weakness, love as leverage, and family as opportunity for control. She taught me that protecting the people we love sometimes requires strategies that feel uncomfortable, but that the alternative, allowing manipulation to succeed, is far worse. Scott will always be Leela's father, and I hope someday he becomes the parent she deserves. But whether he does or not, she'll know that she comes from a line of women who refuse to be victims, who fight for justice, and who love fiercely enough to move mountains when necessary. I closed the journal and placed it back on the vanity, next to a framed photo of 3 generations: my mother, myself, and Leela at last Christmas, all of us laughing at some joke I couldn't remember but whose joy was perfectly captured in that moment. Tomorrow, I would wake up in a house that belonged to us, in a life that we'd chosen, rather than one that had been imposed upon us. Leela would go to school without anxiety about what questions she might face when she came home. I would go to work knowing that my professional success was mine to build and enjoy, without worrying about how it might be used against me in legal proceedings. The war that Scott had started by serving divorce papers at my mother's funeral was over. We'd won, not through destruction, but through the simple, powerful act of refusing to be destroyed. We'd survived his attempts to dismantle our family, and in surviving, we'd discovered strengths we'd never known we possessed. As I settled into bed, I thought about my mother's final lesson, that sometimes the most profound victories were the quietest ones. Not the dramatic courtroom revelations or the public downfall of our opponents, but the simple restoration of peace in a 10-year-old girl's life. The return of laughter to our dinner table. The freedom to make plans for the future without fear. of how they might be twisted and used against us. Tomorrow, Leela and I would start planning our summer vacation, something we'd never been able to do during the years when Scott's work schedule and approval were required for every family decision. We'd talked about visiting my cousin in California, about seeing the Pacific Ocean and building sandcastles without anyone calculating how our joy might be weaponized. That was victory. That was justice. That was love protecting itself and thriving. In the space that truth had created, we were somewhere over the rainbow now, and we were never going back. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.